nose and out your mouth, okay?
If you've got a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to Luke chapter 7. This is where we'll spend our time today. We've talked in Sunday school and in other instances, we talk about faith and what it is. And in some ways, I don't think anything's ever improved on the biblical definition of what faith is. That we have an assurance of things hoped for, and we have a confidence in that which we can't see, an evidence for it. But when you move outside the Christian circles and you start to talk about faith, faith becomes something that is more difficult to really narrow down as to what it actually means. People have all sorts of fuzzy notions. Faith for a believer, though, is exercised in a very distinct way, and that is we live in such a way as we act upon the fact that we do believe. We're living in a way that says we believe these things. It's kind of like a child in a way. I think of myself this way. When you pick a child up, a small child especially, and I remember when Jackson was, I couldn't do that now, he's 200-something pounds, but when he was really small, I could throw him in the air and catch him, and he just loved that. Well, if a stranger were to do that, he wouldn't love it at all, because he didn't have the confidence that he would be caught. When I did it, he never felt like he wasn't safe. That's the way God looks at us, in that sense of that kind of believing. Let's take a look at this text and see what it would show us. I'll begin reading in Luke chapter 7, verse 1. After Jesus finished teaching this to the people, he entered Capernaum. And a centurion there had a slave who was highly regarded, but who was sick and at the point of death. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some of the Jewish elders to ask Jesus to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, the Jewish elders earnestly urged him, "This man is worthy for you to have you come do this for him, because he loves our nation. He even helped to build our synagogue." So Jesus went with the elders. When he was not far from the centurion's house, the centurion sent friends out to them to say, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. That's why I didn't presume to come to you. Instead, just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am someone set under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to this one, 'Go,' and that soldier goes. I say to another, 'Come,' and the soldier comes. I say to my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the man. He turned and said to the crowd that followed him, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." And so when those who had been sent to Jesus returned to the house, they found the slave well. This centurion believes like a little kid. I mean, what reference point does he have that he would believe that Jesus could do any of this? Jesus is just a Palestinian Jew. He's wandering around teaching. He was recognized as a rabbi, but beyond that, why does this Roman centurion even think that Jesus could possibly secure this healing in this way, even if he were to come to the man's house? And centurions were really special people. They weren't just your average Roman. A centurion, there's a historian by the name of Polybius who wrote regarding centurions. He said, "They're not quick to jump into a fight. They're very measured in their thinking. They're not one to do anything rash, but if they are hard pressed, they will stand at their post unto death." So these are not just run-of-the-mill Romans, a centurion. This is a person who's a really hard, critical thinker. And yet, somehow he looks at Jesus and says, "This guy can heal my slave." What's going on there? I mean, after all, in the Roman culture, a slave was a hoe, or a rake, or a shovel, or a towel. Literally, they were just an implement to be used. If you had weeds that had to be hoed in the garden, the slave did it. If you had something that needed to be wiped off, the slave did it. You had a house slave who would take care of washing people's feet when they came in the house. And it was just expected. There was no question about whether that slave would perform those duties, just like the text says. And so in the Roman culture, the legal system was such that, let's just say, for instance, you became just mildly dissatisfied with your slave, you could kill them. There was no law that said you couldn't, and you were under no consequence if you decided that was the best way to handle that. If you decided the slave got too old to work, you just turned them out. You're done with that rake. And so it didn't matter what happened to the slave after that, and there was no consequence for it whatsoever. Keep in mind, 25% of the Roman Empire was composed of slaves. That's a lot of people. So for this centurion to think this about his slave says something about him, I think. That this centurion was not your average Roman at all. The centurion was also Roman in a sense in that Romans all liked religion. They did. I mean, after all, they have the pantheon, Jupiter and Mars and the rest of the mob. And so they have that. They also recognized all kinds of mystery religions. Judaism was one that they did not like. As much as they liked religion, Judaism was not their favorite because they thought that the Jews were just completely barbaric people. I mean, after all, they kept a herd in Jerusalem of 250,000 sheep. And every day, twice a day, they went out and collected one and brought it back and sacrificed it in the temple. And so the Roman perspective on Judaism was these people are just barbaric, primitive people. And yet somehow this centurion looks at Jesus, the Jewish rabbi, and says, this guy can heal my slave. I mean, it's a pretty incredible thing here. And he seems to have a sense of respect that you don't expect out of a Roman either. He sends the Jewish elders. He doesn't go to Jesus himself. He understands enough of Jewish law to know that you're not to associate with a Gentile if you're a Jew. So he finds some lesser people and sends them to Jesus so that he's represented there, so that he doesn't in some way contaminate Jesus, the rabbi. I mean, this guy's got a lot going on in his mind. He didn't think himself worthy to come and have a direct contact with Jesus. That's just incredible to me. And yet, he's a centurion, so he's accustomed, just as the text says, look, if I tell somebody under me to go, they go. And if I tell them to come, they come. And yet, he doesn't command Jesus. He asks the Jews for a favor here. Man. So what's going on? Well, I'm going to say there were people in the Roman Empire who were what were known as proselytes. That is, somebody who became converted to Judaism, not as an ethnic Jew, but as a Roman, as a Gentile. And the reason for that is they, like a lot of people, became very dissatisfied with the Roman pantheon. I mean, after all, you got Zeus eating his children. I mean, that's really not the kind of person that you'd raise your children up to emulate. So they looked at the Roman gods and they said, these people are worse than we are. And they looked at the God that the Jews worshiped, and they saw the austerity and all of the moral configurations that they saw in Jewish people, and they were attracted to it. Lots of them were. They saw a quality there that they themselves did not have available to them. And this is a time in history when people believed lots of things. I mean, in all honesty, my reading of Roman history, most Romans, the average Roman, they believed a lot of strange things, but they really didn't believe that there were all these super beings living up on Mount Olympus. They really didn't. They talked that way. Makes me wonder a lot about our culture, where in our culture people talk about God a lot, but whether they really believe in him or not is a whole nother question. Well, the Romans were the same. They believed things like this: if you walked past a mud puddle and you could see through to the bottom of the puddle, then the water was safe to drink. They did. That's the kind of stuff they believed. So you're dealing with a people who were both sophisticated and very primitive at the same time. But this centurion, with all of his sophistication, with all the military training, he comes to Jesus just like a little child and believes that Jesus is going to heal his slave without any precedent there for that. I just think this is so remarkable. He believes in him not only to the point that he'll heal him, but to the point that Jesus doesn't even have to come. Jesus doesn't have to contaminate himself with a Gentile centurion in order that this slave would be healed. He sees himself as unworthy. You know, as I think about myself, as a human being, as a person. The only reason I'm worthy that I can talk to the Lord in the way we just did as we prayed for all these people is because Jesus has made me worthy. There's nothing in me. This centurion has somehow captured this about Jesus. He sees himself as unworthy. And I'll tell you, this is where, for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, what the Bible says regarding our heart condition means so much. Think about David and what he'd done with Bathsheba. We all know that story. And yet in the time period wherein he has that moment, he says this: the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, God, you will never turn away. That's the way this centurion is seen. He's got a broken and contrite heart. He's come to Jesus in the way that we all do. He's just come to him and bent that knee and said, Jesus, I believe you can do this. Will you do this for me? I mean, so faith is something different than a lot of times what we think it to be. People everywhere, I have people with whom I correspond, as some of you know, who say there is no such thing as faith, and they don't have any faith. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's just stupid. I mean, you get in a car, you push the brake pedal, right? You do think the car is going to come to a stop. There's a certain level of faith being exercised every time you stand upright and don't just fall over, or every time you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes and you see. You're believing that you will do that each day. There's all kinds of things that we believe. And when we come to Jesus in this way, there's a sense of what William James, the philosopher, called precursive faith. That is, we come into this moment believing something before we even have the evidence that we can believe it. It's exactly like that with God. We make this list up all the time, and we bring these things to God with a sense of real belief that God is listening to us. Do you ever stop and think what it means to just close your eyes and start to pray as though God is listening? That's an incredible thing we're doing. To me, I think, man, I mean, we're rational people, right? We don't see God. I've never had God take me by the hand that I knew it. I've never heard a voice. But I believe that when I start speaking, I believe He's listening to me now. So I want to be fairly careful as to what I might say. But this is the genius of God, is that He understands His human creation sufficiently to know that He doesn't rest the whole thing in what you and I can intellectually come to believe. Totally. That there's a sense in which when the 6-year-old says, take care of my mommy or take care of my daddy, God, that God is listening to that in the same way He listens to any of us. That's precursive faith. We're coming to it with a sufficiency of faith, a sufficiency of belief that says God will actually listen to us. It's not an intellectual thing necessarily. It's partly that, but gosh, what do you say to somebody who perhaps doesn't have the intellectual chops to understand all of the gospel? How is it then that they come to salvation? It's not all intellectual. God will always respond to the broken and the contrite heart. Did you know in the Old Testament there's not even a word for faith? There is no word for faith in the Old Testament. All they understood was chesed. That is, that God is faithful to me. God is faithful to Himself and faithful to me to keep His promises and to always listen. And the Jew came to God with that sense of God's chesed with no expectation other than they were asking for it. That's all. So the beauty of God's offer to all of us and to this centurion is it doesn't dismiss our intellect. It's not something that we have to check our brains at the door in order to accept. It's that God bypasses it completely in order that the 5-year-old who hears the gospel can believe it and ask Jesus to come live in their heart. The 5-year-old can ask Jesus to save their mom or their dad when they're sick, just like the centurion asked Jesus to save his slave. This centurion, there's no reason for any of this except that God has done something in this centurion, because he's a person of position. Jesus is not. Jesus is not. He must have believed that Jesus was somebody really important in a certain way, such that he could believe that Jesus could heal his slave. You know, God has done for us something so remarkable when you think about it. All of us in this room have known something of some kind of suffering, whether ourselves or somebody we love. And God never asks us to face anything that he himself has not faced in some way, ever. You know, I've probably told this story, but when I was working in heavy construction, sometimes the foreman would be sick, or maybe their wife is having a baby and they've got to take the day off. And so we would be the crew, and the office would send an engineer out there to oversee the crew. We didn't have any respect for that engineer, because the engineer had never done what we're doing. He would say, climb that form 200 feet up in the air and hook your safety belt off and take that apart. We knew he had never done that. But he had no problem asking me to do it. Well, we didn't have a whole lot. We did it, but we had no respect for these people. The foreman was different. You see, the foreman had come up the way we came. He'd done all that stuff. So if he asked me to do it, no problem whatsoever. That's like God. That is exactly like the gospel. The reason that we can come to Jesus and have that confidence is he's been there and done it. God has been there and done that. We're not dealing with a high priest who doesn't know anything about what we suffer and what we care about. There's no request of God that is too silly to ask. Man, I love that. So can we say to ourselves, we've all found a resting place in that? Can we say we've all found a resting place in that belief structure, in that faith? Can we all say, I've come to Jesus and asked him for that forgiveness? Only you and I know that, and God knows it. Only you and I and God know that. But man, when I look at the price that was paid, I have to wonder, why would anybody want to live out their entire life after they've heard the gospel with the tension of whether or not it's true? Why would you want to have to go through your whole life as an adult knowing that someday, we're going to leave this world? And God has provided the relief for that tension over that prospect. Why would you want to go through life like that? Why not be just like an infant when they're thrown in the air by the person that loves them? They know they're going to be caught. God will always catch us. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me, I'll stay here.